Let me begin by thanking NTID for inviting me here. This is the third time I've come to your college, and it's beautiful. The first time that I came, it was small, and it looked interesting, and I was like, it's kind of a tiny college. And then the second time I came, I saw a lot of growth, and this is my third time, and it is different, but it's a beautifully designed campus, very nice college environment. I did my research with Betsy Winston. We researched this topic together. She's not here with me today physically, but she's here with us in spirit. So I'd like to thank Betsy for being such a great collaborator. How many interpreters are in the audience? Just to let you know, getting interpreters to participate in a study is something that I really appreciate so much, and I wanted to thank all of the interpreters who are willing to share their work for the benefit of the field. The interpreters who participated in our study were opening of their hearts and their minds and their work. And I'd also like to thank the interpreters who are working with me today, because as I talk about my research, I want to make sure that the information I'm sharing is clear to all. So, educational interpreting. I know that I'm old. I'm still an interpreter, and I still practice. Let me see if I should tell you how many years. I've been interpreting 30-something years. At 34 years, truly feels like 34 minutes. The field has changed. There are new challenges, new things every day. So it's fresh. I'm still learning as a practitioner, and that's why I do it. As Cam mentioned, I was an elementary school teacher. I provided teaching in a direct instruction setting. And then I realized that my students were getting taller than me, so I decided to teach adults. However, my point is that I have experience interacting with deaf students and deaf-blind students in a direct instruction setting. I know what works, and I've learned what doesn't work. Also, I noticed that many of those students, when they would graduate, interpreting students, when they would graduate, they would go out into educational settings. And I always wondered if the preparation that I gave them as an interpreter educator was effective for students who are in the mainstream. In Canada, as in US, more and more schools for the deaf are shutting down and students are being mainstreamed. The concept of inclusion is very strong in Canada, but inclusion for deaf individuals usually means one individual in a larger hearing setting. And it's made me wonder what is successful and what is not successful. So we decided to apply for a grant for this study. And I'll give you a background about the study, and then I'll talk specifically about the TAP study that I'm going to present this afternoon. Many of you, regardless of your age, understand the challenges of an educational setting. You can see on this slide the classroom. It's really a complicated situation in which to navigate. So your learning requires a multitude of abilities, but imagine if you're a deaf student in the same setting, going through this complex environment, but through a mediator, an interpreter, or recipient. I asked interpreters in my study what they saw as challenges in their work, and some of the words on the slide are the answers that they gave me. Some interpreters said it's challenging because the children come to school and their native language has not been established yet, so they really don't have a foundational language on which to build. They arrive not ready for school, which is challenging. And I would say many interpreters, their second language does not have a good foundation, so that's a complicating factor. There are some certified interpreters in the educational setting, but does that mean they're qualified? Other schools will hire anybody who can sign. If a person says that they can sign, the school does not have an assessment or screening in which to hire people, and they'll hire basically anyone. Also, interpreters have the interpreting duty plus other duties as assigned in the school system. Interpreters also in the school system wonder if they're really trained to work with the children with whom they're working. Often interpreter training programs teach students how to work with adult populations, but the training lacks education about working with children and the developmental stages in which they go through. Also, the skills for educational interpreters are many. And for me, sometimes I've written the phrase, the myth of inclusion, because people will talk about inclusion and they'll see an interpreter, and there's an assumption that because the interpreter is there, that the person is included. And so the myth of inclusion looks at the physicality of the person being in the classroom, but it's missing all of the complexities of the environment that the student's missing out on. So it's really an illusion. Interpreters also mention boundaries, screenings. Interpreters mention their own education. All of this is challenging for them. For the past 6 or 7 years, I've used the concept of mediated education as opposed to educational interpreting. And from my research, we talk about educational interpreting as if it's factual, that we are interpreting as interpreters and we are being 100% effective. The teacher is saying something and it's going through the interpreter 100%. But truly, the concept of a mediated experience is there is an exchange. It's going through a third individual, and the third individual is making decisions about that information. And we need to recognize that. The individuals who work at the schools, who are the stakeholders, need to understand that it's really not direct instruction. It's mediated because it's going through another service provider. Now, the question is, who are we interpreting for? And when we were studying, and in what context? And so we wanted to look at the who and the context, the where. When we were doing our research, we were looking at the assumption that what is good for one is good for all. So if you hire a qualified interpreter, then is that good for everyone? And so we are hypothesizing that hiring a qualified interpreter is just the tip of the iceberg. So who is the interpreter? For whom are they interpreting? And what is the context in which they are interpreting? A few years ago, I got a grant, and I got this grant to study individuals in the K-12 setting. There were 42 deaf students, and they were in the mainstream with interpreters. And I've thought that the research, that if we did the research on them, it would apply to the future of interpreting. The 42 students were Canadian in grades 3 through 12. So they ranged in age from 8 to 18. Of the 42, we selected 33 for the study. Again, all were Canadian. And if you well know, Canada is a very big country. There were no LSQ interpreters in that study. They were all English-based interpreters, Canadian ASL interpreters. And so when you think about interpreting, what does a quality interpreting sample look like? And what is the academic setting? What are the social experiences of the child? What are the academic experiences of the child? Is the child able to be engaged, or are they just a bystander watching what's happening? So those were the thoughts as we were developing and designing our study. When I've seen the concept of bystander in other venues. I think sometimes the deaf students, when they're in a mainstream environment, they become the bystander because they're disengaged from what's going on within the classroom. Now, I didn't want to analyze interpreters like interpreters have been diagnosed in the past, where you're checking off what they're doing right and what they're doing wrong. I was interested in how the teacher was setting up their classroom and how the interpreter was engaging with the teacher in order to unpack the information that was being shared with the students and to pick out the discourse levels that the instructor was using, as well as the source language information. Up here I have 6 common discourse frames, and metacognitive questions are questions that the teacher wants to find out about the thinking of the students. They're asking questions like, why did this happen, or how did this happen, to let the students think, well, what do I know about this topic already? Do I know anything about the topic? Am I interested in the topic? Metacognitive questions are important for everyday life and navigation. It's good to use metacognitive questions in your daily experience. And so that's one way for an interpreter to recognize a teacher's frame that they're using in the classroom. Scaffolding is another technique that instructors will use. Instructors will teach students based on the knowledge that they have, and then they'll build on the knowledge to a higher goal. It's called scaffolding. Are interpreters aware that the teachers are using these frameworks, that the teacher is scaffolding, and then is the interpreter scaffolding in their interpretation? Reconceptualizing means that the teacher will explain a concept, and the teacher is aware that the students may not understand it. And as the teacher sees the feedback from the students, the teacher will then re-explain the same concept in a different way. It's important because students sometimes need to hear content 2 or 3 times before they understand that information. And it seems that interpreters just hear the instructor repeating it, and they'll just give the information once. And that's a strategy the interpreter's using to manage their process. However, they're ignoring the larger goal that the teacher has. Reciprocal teaching often happens peer-to-peer. It's with the students when they're speaking to one another and they're re-explaining or talking about what was happening in the class. The question is, how can deaf students be engaged, or can they be engaged, or are they being engaged in the study that we were framing? Feedback. Feedback is something you give positive comments for one student, and then a student hears that positive comment and it says, well, I want to get that positive comment that the person over there got, and so they work harder to get that positive feedback from the teacher, and negative comments are shared as well. Teachers, again, have reasons for giving the positive and the negative feedback, and often what we saw in the interpreted classroom was that many of the feedback strategies that the instructor was using were being eliminated in the interpretation in order to manage the process. Sequencing is important for thought processing, breaking down a larger topic into smaller chunks. So often sequencing, there will be steps. You can do something first, then second, then third, then fourth. And by the end of it, you'll know the whole. Again, when we watched the video clips of the interpreters, often the steps were not repeated in their correct sequence. And the then deaf student followed what the interpreter said, but then made a mistake because the interpreter had misaligned the sequencing of the steps. So these were the 6 discourse frames that we looked in our research, and here's a slide that shows the finding of our research. Of the 33 students, they all had qualified interpreters. Many were certified either through RID or AVLIC. Many had been interpreting for more than 3 years. Many had many years of experience interpreting. So these were not new interpreters. They were very qualified, experienced, well-seasoned interpreters who were in our study. And you can see our findings. If you look at the column that says accurate and effective, if you look at the next column, often more than 80% were not accurate or effective. So it means that 80% of the metacognitive questions were just simplified, and they were made it so the individual who was deaf, seeing the question, got it directly and wasn't using the discourse structure that the instructor wanted, which was to have the deaf individual think about what he or she knew about the topic. So when you eliminate that process, what's the impact on the child's education?
Provide an example of that for us, please.
Sure. The professor would ask why. Well, if something happened in a specific chemistry class, why did this happen? Or, in a social studies class, why did the politics of this country go awry? And the interpreter would often say, did the politics in the country go awry? Which is a very different question than why did it happen. In chemistry, the class was, why did this chemical reaction happen? And then the interpretation was, these two chemicals got mixed. What happened? Scaffolding in that category, you can see 86% was not interpreted accurately. So again, the teacher has an intent. Maybe the teacher's pace was the pace was too fast, and so the interpreter, rather than using scaffolding methods within the interpretation, decided to shorten the information, get the information out more directly, but didn't scaffold for the students. For reciprocal teaching, again, it's a way for the students to participate, but because the students were unable to participate, the deaf students were passive bystanders and often didn't know what to do, and the teacher didn't intervene and just assumed that things were going well in the group, but the interpreter was busy keeping up with what all the hearing students were saying. Reconceptualizing, if you look at that, 75% was inaccurate, and that has to relate to processing time and pace of the classroom, pace of instruction. So it's interpreters thinking about how can I reconceptualize, but instead of thinking about how they can reconceptualize and build that into their interpretation, they're thinking about the time that they're losing and they're giving up information. The instructors don't know that all of this is happening because they see an interpreter in the classroom and they see that they just assume that everything is happening as she or he has intended it to be. Now, sequencing. This was a chemistry lab. The instructor gave the steps, 1 through 5. The interpreter got the steps incorrect. Because of the interpreter process, they got the first step, then they missed the second step, they missed the third step, but they heard the fourth step, so they put that in, which was really the second step. Then the interpreter remembered the second step and added it, which was really the third step. And what happened was there was an explosion in the lab as a result. So we have to think about these strategies. And then the last one, feedback. Interpreters, again, seem to use the time that the instructor had a discourse reason and an educational reason built in. The interpreter used the time to mediate their process and wasn't providing that feedback mechanism that the students needed. And that feedback mechanism helps to build engagement in a classroom. So if the student doesn't have that engagement in the classroom, they're not feeling included.
If you want to access more information about the study, you can access videotapes and have presented on this topic. And this is the website with which you can access it. So, of course, as the results of these studies were very disturbing and saddening, I have to say, I assumed that we would see successful work because we included these very skilled interpreters in all of these classrooms. They were good interpreters, but when we went and analyzed their work from the teacher's perspective related to language and teaching techniques, we saw that there was a glaring issue. It seemed when we were interviewing teachers, they really didn't understand that they knew about the teaching process, but the interpreters didn't know how to include that into the context in which they're working with an interpreter. So they didn't know that they needed to slow down when turn taking was happening so the interpreting could be happening successfully. For me, inclusion means three things: social and emotional engagement in the classroom. They enjoy being there. They feel part of the classroom. Academic engagement, which means they can pass the courses and master the information. And intellectual engagement, which means they're learning things and they're curious. They want to learn more. If these three things are satisfied, then possibly you could call this situation inclusion. If you don't have social and emotional engagement or academic or intellectual engagement, it's not inclusion. So the results of this study were very disheartening. Betsy and I when I shared my results with Betsy, she said, "You know what? Let's establish another research study on how to fix these issues. We need to look at this." The Rico and I taught together at Northeastern University, and we used TAP there. And Betsy suggested it to me to use again, and I thought, what a wonderful idea. So the next study, Betsy and I worked together to use the Think Aloud processing. So because the evidence shows us that interpreters are missing and omitting things in those 6 critical areas, those functions aren't there, we need to look at their thought processes. So how do you look at someone's thought process? You can't see it visually. You don't know what is going on inside a person's head while they're interpreting. So we need to know how that thought process influences the interpreting process. So we set up 2 research questions to get us started. Again, many of the research studies emphasize that the deaf child, we think about their thoughts. But what about what the interpreter is thinking? What's going on in their head while they're working? How do we analyze that? And another question was, could we use the Think Aloud protocol or process and stimulate recall to help us understand what's going on in an interpreter's mind while working in a classroom? It's hard to see. The numbers might be a bit small, but we had 12 participants for this study. Again, we included good interpreters in our study. Of these 12 interpreters, 2 of them had ASL as their first language because they were CODAs. 2 members of the study had AVLIC certification. I don't know if you're familiar with the AVLIC test, but holy God, it's a very hard test. It's very difficult. Not many of our interpreters in Canada passed the AVLIC test, but we had 2 who were COI, certified interpreters. 3 had RID certification. At that time, it was CICT. When you introduced me with a CSE, that you just outed me as an old person. But thank you. I got my CSE when I was 5, just to be clear. But yeah, that's an old certification, the CSE. So these 2 interpreters had CICT RID certification. Again, they had previous experience. These were not new interpreters. They had at least 4 years to 33 years of education. One person had 6 to 10 years of experience. 8 of our participants had 11 to 17 years of experience interpreting. So they're well-versed in their field. 2 of them had more than 30 years of experience. Pretty amazing. Two of the interpreters who participated had graduate degrees. The others had degrees from interpreting programs. So my point is that we're not using new interpreters. We're not looking at student performance. These are well-experienced, well-versed interpreters. Are any of you familiar with TAP? Think Aloud protocol. CAM is. You've heard of it. Rico's familiar with it, of course. TAP helps us to know what's happening in someone's mind while they're working on a task. Spoken language interpreter training uses it. In other fields, it's used as well. It helps us to understand what we can't see visually. You can't see into someone's mind to see the neurons firing and what have you. But by asking a person questions to talk while they're looking at a stimulus, it helps us understand what their thought process is. So we use the TAP process. Interpreters would watch a 20-minute segment of a classroom. It was a real classroom with a teacher who was teaching a lesson. We had real students, and they were given a deaf student profile so they knew how to tailor their output to suit the students' needs. And it ranged from elementary, middle, and high school levels. Then they went ahead and watched the segment, and they had to think, if I'm interpreting this, how would I do it? They could sign it or they could use spoken English. And we videotaped that Think Aloud protocol for 20 minutes. Then they went ahead and interpreted the same segment that they'd already seen and thought about for 20 minutes. At the end of that, we had a stimulated recall session with them. They'd watch what they did and they could talk about what was going on in their heads, whether they were uncomfortable or whether they got stuck on one concept or what have you. And again, Think Aloud protocol means that you don't give them things to talk about. You allow the person just to say whatever comes to mind while they're watching the stimulus. Any answer is fine. There's no right or wrong. It just helps us to see what the individual is thinking about as they're watching. So we videotaped the TAP sessions, the interpreting, and then the stimulated recall. We analyzed it several times. Betsy and I each analyzed it, and our research assistants analyzed it as well. They were teachers and certified interpreters analyzed it. So 3 of us analyzed it 5 times each, and then we came together and looked for common themes, and then we watched it again to code the common themes. So we came up with 4 categories. We came up with plenty of data. I just used a Canadian sign. This means plenty. It's a Canadian sign. Yes, plenty. We had a plethora of data, if you will, from the 12 interpreters interpreting for 20 minutes. They would think aloud, then they would interpret, and then they would do the stimulus recall. So we had plenty of data to analyze. So we looked at all of that, coded it 5 times, each of us, and then we found coding labels that emerged. What people said while they were thinking aloud seemed to fit into these 4 categories. The blue here on top were comments related to the teacher intent and goal of the lesson and what they were doing with the language. And that showed the interpreter was thinking about how the teacher is using the language and what strategies they're using to get the students to learn. And it was proof that the interpreter was thinking about that. The next level, this is an example of a higher order thinking. The next level was student needs. The interpreter worked to ensure they were meeting the students' needs. The next was the interpreting process. Should I sit or should I stand? There's noise in the classroom. So that was interpreting processing. All the noise that goes on in your head while you're interpreting. The lower order thinking was linguistic issues. Focusing on linguistics means while interpreters were talking, they were thinking about words. They were talking about word. They were at the lexical level of processing. So these common categories emerged, and all of the comments we received from the interpreters while they were doing the tap fit into these 4 categories. And we counted how many comments were provided and which fit into which categories. Then we went ahead and analyzed the interpreting itself. We watched the interpreting product to rate it as effective or ineffective. And we overlaid the 6 codes that I talked about previously. And now I'll show you what happened with the results. Of the 12 interpreters, 3 of them were effective interpreting in classroom, no question. If you look at their tap, you'll see where their comments which categories their comments mostly fell into. 48% of their comments had to do with what the teacher was doing with the language and what the teacher was trying to accomplish with the turn taking in the classroom. What was their goal of all of that work? 48% of effective interpreters worked in that category while they were thinking aloud. 40% of the interpreters were making decisions about processing the information. 9% were focusing on student needs, and 3% focused on language and word usage and lexical level functioning. These were the effective interpreters. Again, 3 from 12. This is just an example of an interpreter thinking aloud. So that interpreter very obviously was thinking about the teacher's intent and why she was using what language she was using, and she knew that they were trying to make a link between the teacher and the student. They weren't thinking about, what's the sign for this drug? What's the sign for that drug? 46 comments in total from this interpreter in social studies and 31 for the health topic that the interpreter interpreted. This is pretty good. You can see the number count of how many comments related to teacher intent, how many were related to student need, how many related to the interpreting process, and how many were related to language. And for me, this interpreter had 0 comments related to language for social studies. She wasn't thinking about language at all. She was thinking about the teacher intent, the student need, and the interpreting process. In health, again, there was only 1 language-related issue. RF was our acronym for red flags. Betsy and I saw 1 or 2 comments from interpreters that were far afield from what the activity was, what the task at hand was. We were wondering what was happening with the interpreter. We'll discuss that more later. Anyway, I didn't want to jump ahead. So, mostly effective interpreters, 2 out of the 12 rated mostly effective. And you'll see a similar habit or pattern of work. 34% were working with the teacher's intent, 42% focusing on interpreter, 9% on the student needs, trying to make sure they met them at their level, and then 50% were focused on language. But overall, the interpreting product was effective. These are most effective and effective. Together were 5 out of 12 interpreters. But again, if you look at the last comment, 27 comments for health and social studies. The other interpreter had over 45 comments for social studies and 31 for health. You'll see the number and quality are correlated.
Most of the time, not effective is the next slide. So most of the time, they were not effective at what the teacher was trying to convey to the students, and you can see the numbers on the slide. The interpreter was only focusing on what the teacher intent was for 13% of the time. 53% of the time, the interpreter was focusing on themselves and the process, and 34% of the time, they were focusing on the language and the linguistic forms. So it was a heavy focus on the language and on the self as the interpreter, and a lack of focus on the teacher and their intent, and zero focus on the students' needs and preferences, zero. So again, if we're just throwing things out, but we have no concept of where we need to meet the individual, what's happening in that classroom. And, there are times when interpreters are just producing information, but they're not checking to see if anybody's out there. No comments about the students is very interesting because the Code of Ethics says that the interpreter has to interact with and relate with the consumers. But are the interpreters right here in this study doing that? So the number of comments were 24. And so what would happen is they would make some comments, and then they would interpret, and then they may or may not have comments post-interpreting. And here's an example of one of the mostly ineffective interpreters. So this shows where the interpreters focusing their attention, wondering if they should be fingerspelling, or wondering, the noise in the room is bothering, whether they should sit or whether they should stand. So rather than thinking about the teacher intent and whether they're using metacognitive questions or scaffolding, the interpreter is thinking about the physical environment. Four out of 12 of the interpreters in our study were ineffective. Now, if you asked the principal of that school, the principal would say, oh, they're great interpreters. But if you actually analyzed their work and the interpreting that was happening in the classroom, they were ineffective. They looked like they were signing, no doubt, but they were not effective in their work. They were not engaging the student academically. They were not engaging any intellectual engagement or curiosity, or they weren't engaging them socially as well. And you can see the numbers that are on the slide. There were very few comments, 8%, about the teacher, and it was 40% about the interpreting process. So all of you in the audience might be sitting here and not feeling too good about yourselves, but this is what the data is showing us. And those of you who are students, you're in the preparation into a new career, and this is something to give you food for thought as you are a student thinking about your future profession. For working interpreters, it's something to think about your work currently and where your focus is. The stimulated recalls was an option that we used to ask the interpreters what they were doing. Like for the effective interpreters with the stimulated recalls, they were thinking more about the larger context, whereas the ineffective interpreters would look at the videotape and they would say, I look pretty good. Oh, I should have fingerspelled that more clearly. That was their, fingerspelling was not the issue. So there were similar patterns that we noticed with the stimulated recalls across the categories that we developed, from effective interpreting to ineffective interpreting. Here's an example on this slide. This interpreter, during the 20 minutes, she said she was trying to figure out the instructor's style and how to apply that style into her interpreting, recognizing that it was challenging, but her work was still effective. Her thought processes were very different. She was not thinking about what's the sign for Democrat or the sign for Ireland or anything like that. Very different, higher order thinking thought processes were going on. This interpreter, who was considered mostly effective, is thinking about the student in this comment and recognizing that as the interpreter, if I just fingerspell all of these ologies, what is the student actually going to retain or maintain? So she's thinking about the student. The interpreter recognizes that she has a lot of background experience to support the education and the conveyance of the information. If you look at DM's comment, it just shows that DM took no responsibility for her work in that classroom. She said the problems were all out there. It was the map, it was the noise. I couldn't see the students, so she had many excuses. The previous two slides, they used very assertive language, but on this slide, DM uses very passive language and is passing the buck. And then if you look at CM's comment as well, look at that. She just said, I'm lost. I couldn't keep up. It was busy up there. She couldn't interpret. So, and it showed in her work. In CM again, there was no introspective understanding of what was going on. There was no thoughts about relating to the four categories. She just said that she was lost and basically gave up. Very disheartening to see that comment. I had mentioned we used a fifth category, which is red flag. There were 3 comments that were red flagged. One comment was red flagged because it was derogatory about the teacher. Now, we're all human. There are people we don't like sometimes. Whereas interpreters, some people don't like us. And so the interpreter made a comment that was derogatory about the teacher. We needed to keep in mind that when we're interpreting, we can't start being distracted by judgments that are coming to mind. We have to be attentive to what our task is and what we're doing. So let me talk about what the results show. Overall, very experienced interpreters had deeper processing of thought, more introspective thought processes, and higher order thinking. They saw the interpreter as an interactor in the setting and had more complex understanding of what was going on. They understood that interpreting was complex, but they applied their theories to resolve the problems and challenges that were in the context in which they were working. The interpreters who were all over the place were not as effective, but the effective interpreters were primarily looking at these complex criteria which were in the classroom. The experienced interpreters used their raw knowledge. They had much greater awareness of how they can co-construct meaning, looking at the child in front of them, thinking about what the teacher's goals are, and thinking about what they can bring in the interpreter process to construct meaning that's effective for the individual. And knowing that language is a negotiation process and it's interactive and it's not word by word. The individual lexical items are important. I don't want to minimize that importance. But if you're just looking at the individual lexical items only, you're not going to be effective.
So interpreters who are ineffective during their stimulated response, they said, oh, well, if I had prepped, I would have been much more successful in this process. There have been lots of times that I have prepped, I have been completely ineffective. But what would you do to prep? It seems as though they didn't use their previous experience and knowledge. Again, they were experienced interpreters, but they didn't use that experience to help them in the situation, to analyze the teacher's goals and in teaching the lesson. Winston and I looked at spoken language interpreting publications that used TAPs. And there was one Swedish researcher, I'm not going to say their name, it's up there, it's JAS, many, many letters after that, found similar results with translators. Experienced translators, when they did the TAP process, they had a myriad of comments. They didn't focus on the words. They focused on the process and the goal. They were more metacognitive in their processes. They thought about solutions and the audience while they were working. So there were similar findings with our research. Of course, every study has strengths and every study can be improved upon. We drew this information from a pool of 12 interpreters, but we did again have a myriad of data. We had a written description of a deaf student, but maybe perhaps if we had provided a video of the deaf student introducing themselves via sign language, they may have been able to provide that interpreting services at a better rate for that student to fit them. The results are similar to the spoken language TAP research. So what does this mean for interpreters and students of interpreting? It definitely applies to me. I think it applies to all of us. We all have things to learn about the interpreting process. And this research shows that if we focus on our processes of thinking and focus on the higher order thinking, considering language and goals of the presenter, our interpreting will improve. If we focus on the language use and that iterative, interactive process of dialogue in the classroom, interpreting will become more effective. Interpreters who weren't effective were obsessed over the words. So their view of interpreting means I hear a word, I sign a word, in, out, in, out. And it's very rapid fire interpreting. For a deaf child, it's completely inaccessible. It doesn't accomplish the goals of the teacher, nor does it include the student in the educational process. As interpreters and teachers, we need to think about what it means to interpret. It's critical to discuss this. If, the interpreter is working with two languages, yes, but you have to have a discourse and you have to look at the function and the scopus of the entire event. If you use that view of interpreting, it will influence the interpreting process and product as a result. If it's just transcoding hearing language and providing visual language to match it, that's a different interpreting product. For a child or an adult, the results are very different. I think as teachers of interpreters, as mentors, and as experienced interpreters, we can use TAPs more often to help us discover ways to improve the level of our thinking processes while working. I think mentors can help interpreters talk about their work in a way that they can focus on the higher order thinking as opposed to the lexical level of processing. As I said before, the feedback written between two interpreters, all of the notes we've taken, it seems to suggest that, sometimes you say, you signed this, you should have signed that instead. You said this, you should have said that. If that's the kind of feedback that we're giving one another, then we really are just working at the lexical level. If we are thinking more broadly and more in depth of the process and the point of the message, we will be more successful in our feedback. If we're teaching interpreters, we need to teach them how to handle that cognitive load while they're working. And I'm not sure we do that in our interpreting programs today. I'd like to suggest that, these 4 categories, maybe it would be helpful to teach interpreters to work within these categories and play with those labels of what you call them. Ask the interpreters to prep with these 4 categories in mind for an interpreting event. If those 4 labels can be helpful, it can improve our interpreting work. And if it helps an interpreter to analyze more deeply the work that they're creating, then I think it would be a useful tool. So my last question to all of you is, are we tapping into the power of taps in our interpreting work and our teaching of interpreters? Thank you so much for coming. Thank you for your attention and for not falling asleep. And now I turn it over to you to ask me questions and make comments. Thank you so much.